Next topic is arousal. So arousal is our activation levels, how up for it we are. So this goes from being fast asleep to being very, very excited at the other end. The difference to anxiety is that anxiety must be negative. It's a perception anxiety, and it's that we perceive it as negative, that it's bad for us. Okay, so it's going to cause me some concern. Two types of anxiety. The first one is cognitive. Cognitive means thinking, to do with the brain. So cognitive anxiety is concerns I have that are in my head. Concerns like that I won't be able to complete a task. I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I'm going to lose. What happens if I let my teammates down? Those kind of statements that you are saying to yourself, like we've just said, that the verbal persuasion thing, the negative bit where we put ourselves down. Somatic anxiety is to do with physiological responses. So these are concerns I have about my arousal, my physiological arousal levels. Okay, so it's the fact that I'm sweating and I think that that's bad for me. Because remember that if the fact that I'm sweating is just my arousal. Okay, but if I think I'm sweating too much, that's bad for my performance. Alright, I'm going to get dehydrated. Now I'm suddenly in anxiety because I'm concerned about it, I'm worried about it. So things about your heart rate, that I feel weak, I feel tense, these types of things. So how does anxiety affect our performance? So firstly, cognitive anxiety on this side. As cognitive anxiety goes up, performance comes down generally. Alright, so the more worries I have in my head, more negative statements I say to myself, the worse my performance gets. That's slightly different with somatic anxiety. Alright, it's suggested, research tells us that this bit, that a little bit of somatic anxiety is actually positive for us. That it actually gets us going. So a few nerves around, a few butterflies in the stomach type of thing, gets us up to a better performance. But then if that gets too much, I get too tense, I'm sweating too much, etc., then that actually performance suffers. And just as a comparison, the confidence, on the other hand, increases performance as it goes up. So your confidence on the right hand side is like your opposite to your cognitive anxiety. Okay, how does anxiety kick in, or when does it kick in? So we look at the days before and the hours before. Cognitive anxiety might creep in and already be quite high even days before, or weeks before, months before. If it's a big competition, if you're going to Olympic Games, you might have some worries about how you're going to perform, what happens if I lose, what happens if I don't perform well on the day. So my cognitive anxiety might be quite high already, alright, in the days or in the lead up to the competition. So that's here, this green line. You would hope that somatic anxiety is going to be fairly low, because you'd be really struggling if we've got anxiety around that we're sweating and that you're tense already and stuff like that weeks beforehand. Alright, we'd be a physical wreck. So somatic anxiety only kicks in the hour or so before competition, or certainly on the day of the competition. So that's why this goes up here quite steeply. Once competition starts, it's thought that somatic anxiety goes then down very quickly as well. So we get rid of the somatic anxiety. So once we start to play, those concerns around the sweating and the tension and all that sort of stuff, they disappear, because we start to obviously we're running around and things like that, and we get the blood pumping and we feel okay on that side of it. The cognitive anxiety is different. Now there's two lines here, alright, that represent two options. That if things are going well, cognitive anxiety would go down. If things are going badly, cognitive anxiety remains high. The other option of that, though, is that it can go like that. It could go up and down depending on how well I was playing. Alright, so if I'm doing badly at a certain point, cognitive anxiety might increase or remain high. If I start to do well for a period, it might go down. So just be aware, what you need to know is that cognitive anxiety can go one of two ways or both ways during competition, where somatic anxiety disappears. We also have trait and state anxiety. So your trait anxiety for trait is natural, so it's your natural level of anxiety, alright, that we're born with, we're born that way. So some people are natural worriers, some people are naturally really laid back, they don't have any worries, therefore their trait anxiety will be really low. Your state anxiety, state is in a certain state, in a certain situation. Okay, so it's situation specific. So on a given day, my state anxiety again would be high, low, medium or whatever. Your trait anxiety is one of the things that affects the state anxiety. So the two kind of link a bit together, because obviously if you're naturally a worrier, if you're a 9 out of 10 trait anxiety, then in most situations your state anxiety will be quite high. You know, even in a non-threatening situation you might still be at a 6 or a 7. And obviously in a worrying type situation you'll be a 10 out of 10 instead of a 9 maybe. What we're saying is that 9 out of 10 person would normally not worried at all and be a 2 out of 10. Drive theory is a theory of arousal. It suggests generally that as arousal increases, so does performance. On the graph there, it's a linear relationship, so it increases at the same rate. However, you need to know a bit more about the ins and outs of drive theory and how it was progressed. So the original theory basically just said what we've said on the graph. They then added to it later on and talked about this dominant response. So you really need to talk about dominant response. It comes in quite nicely. So DR for dominant response, DR for drive theory, the first two letters in drive, DR. So your dominant response takes over with those high levels of arousal that we talked about. You should use two examples here about dominant response. Talk about an example of a novice and talk about an example of an expert. So a novice's dominant response, your dominant response is the most likely occurrence, right, the most likely one to occur, the most well-learned response. So a novice's dominant response is a poor one. All right, their dominant response is not well-learned. All right, they don't perform the skill particularly well consistently. So the most likely occurrence is a poor performance. So what we're saying is that therefore, under conditions of high arousal, when the dominant response takes over and kicks in, that a novice will perform badly under those conditions. The expert, however, whose dominant response is well grooved, well learned, they can do the skill really well because they're in the autonomous phase of learning. All right, they can do it automatically. So with high levels of arousal, dominant response takes over. Their dominant response is a good one. 9 times out of 10 they'll perform well. Therefore, under high arousal they will perform well. Inverted U theory. So the first thing is that as arousal increases, performance increases. Okay, so mention that we get an increase in performance as arousal increases initially. That's up to an optimal point. So in the middle there is your optimal point. So that's where we get our best performance. Once arousal continues though to increase, performance starts to suffer and it goes down. Now, inverted U theory can be explained with cue utilization theory. So we're talking about cues. Remember, cues are the stimuli in the environment that we pick out. So, cue utilization theory suggests that your arousal affects the amount of cues that you take in, and therefore that affects how well you perform. So if you're under aroused, which I'll just flip back to the graph here, so at this point on the graph, under arousal gives us bad performance because we take in too many cues. We're not up for it. It might be a game against a rubbish team, alright, or a game that means nothing, a friendly match, and you can't really be bothered. therefore you're thinking about other stuff, you're taking in too much information, you notice the crowd, you know, you're waving to someone on the sidelines, alright, you're thinking about what you're going to have for your tea later, and therefore I'm not concentrating on what I should be concentrating on, therefore my performance is poor. Optimal arousal, my cue detection's working really well, my selective attention is working perfectly, I'm picking out the right cues, I'm disregarding the irrelevant cues, I'm really focused, I'm in my zone, therefore I get my best performance. And with high arousal, so here performance starts to suffer under conditions of high arousal, because now I'm picking out too few cues. Alright, my focus is too narrow. So I'm focusing on one thing when I should be focusing on lots. So an example, when I'm too excited, I'm too up for it. Alright, I may be thinking about winning, or I'm going to be aggressive, I'm just far too aroused, I'm too excited. Alright, I will miss things that go on around me. Alright, so I might be concentrating on marking my player, but other players are making runs in behind me as a defender, and I miss that, and then the opposition might score. So I'm not picking out things, I'm missing things that are going on. The eyes off individual zone of optimal functioning is an extension of inverted U theory. Just going back, inverted U theory says that optimal point is there, bang in the middle of arousal levels. So middle levels of arousal gives best performance. Now we know, because we've talked about in self-efficacy, is that different people like having different levels of arousal. So that's what the individual zone is all about, that we all have our zone. So some people up here like high levels of arousal, they will perform best with high levels of arousal. Some people like middle levels of arousal, some people's zone is down there where they prefer to be more calm and relaxed. Oops. This can depend on a few things. It can be your personality. So extroverts like evaluative situations with other people, they like stimulation, they quite like high arousal situations, so therefore they might perform better in those conditions of high arousal. Introverts have enough excitement, alright, they have a very sensitive reticular activation system, therefore they perform best with low levels of arousal. A simple task that really just requires a good physical effort is better with high levels of arousal. So if I'm up for it, I'll probably perform that physical task quite well. Whereas a more complex perceptual task where I need to make a decision, it needs to be accurate and stuff, that's performed better under low arousal, so I can concentrate on all of those things that I need to get right. And lastly, experts or people in the later stages of learning are able to handle high levels of arousal because they've got room to cope with it. Because they can perform the skill naturally, without having to think about it, they can also at the same time deal with the high levels of arousal and keep that under control. Whereas novices can't do that. Novices need to think about what it is that they're doing, they need to concentrate on the task, therefore they can't concentrate on dealing with arousal as well.